All right. So we are pleased to announce that Paul Wright, the founder and executive director of the Human Rights Defense Center, will be today's guest speaker. This is Paul. Paul also edits Prison Legal News. It's the longest running independent prisoner rights publication in U.S. history. Super impressive. He spent 17 years in prison, and during that time has since successfully litigated many censorship and public records cases against prisons in the United States. The Human Rights Defense Center publishes Prison Legal News monthly. It distributes approximately 50 works related to criminal justice and the law, and is active in prisoner rights litigation. The center has organized a number of projects, including campaigns to reduce the cost of phone calls made by prisoners to their families and friends, as well as to stop the financial exploitation of inmates. It has efforts related to tracking news on the private prison industry and to exploring the intersections between both environmental justice and criminal justice. Let's see what else here. The Human Rights Defense Center began as a single newsletter with all volunteers and has evolved into a national 501c3 organization. They have 18 employees and 4 of those are attorneys. The national headquarters is in Florida, and there are offices in Nashville, Seattle, and Washington, D.C. So we hope that you will enjoy hearing Paul speak about the important work that he does for the Human Rights Defense Center. And with that, I'm going to go ahead. I'm just going to black out my screen, Paul, so feel free to take over and if you need. The last 10 to 15 minutes, around, I believe, 6:15, we'll kind of go in for Q&A, and I'll moderate that for you, okay?
So basically, I just want to, I'm going to start out and give a little bit of background and history on myself and HRDC. And I'm going to talk about kind of the diverse work that we've done over the years and are doing now. I started HRDC in 1990. It was Prison Legal News at the time. And how this started was I was in prison. I was convicted in 1987 of felony murder. I was convicted of killing a drug dealer during an armed robbery. And I was 21 years old. And I went to prison. And upon going into prison, I was kind of really surprised about kind of the brutalization and the dehumanization of the prisoners in prison. And it wasn't anything like what I expected. And ironically, kind of looking back on it now, I mean, prisons, I think, were far better than they are now, both, by almost by every measurable means of, measuring standards of living and condition and things like that. But by around 1990, it was also becoming readily apparent that we're seeing a backlash against that. And I was in prison in Washington State, and I know that Washington has a bit of a reputation, in my opinion, thoroughly misplaced as being a liberal or progressive place. And it's like a lot of things, it's all relative. And unfortunately, a lot of bad ideas got started in Washington. In 1990, the year we started Prison Legal News, Washington became the first state to start civil commitment, where sex offenders would be imprisoned after they had served their criminal sentences. At the same time, Washington also became the first state that started sex offender registries and requiring sex offenders to register on public registries, where the communities were then notified of their presence and location in the communities. In subsequent years, in 1993, Washington became the first state to enact a 3 strikes you're out law, where third-time felons were being sentenced to life without parole for a third felony conviction. So Washington's been kind of on the forefront of a lot of bad ideas, unfortunately. And we thought it was important that prisoners and their families have a voice in what passes for criminal justice debate at this time. And it's kind of really hard to imagine how different things were, because in 1990, there were around 50 independent prisoner rights publications around the country, not just in Washington. California alone had 6 being published at the time. Washington also had a long history of independent prisoner rights publications. And Ed Mead, he was my co-editor and co-founder of Prison Legal News. over the years, he published a number of prisoner rights magazines as well. So we started out publishing, and our first 3 issues were met with a lot of hostility and repression by prison officials. Our first 3 issues were banned in the Washington prison system. We had 75 prospective subscribers that we sent the first issue to, and to see if they liked it. And each magazine was 10 pages long. Ed typed 5 pages in his cell. I typed 5 pages in mine. And we sent it to a volunteer outside the prison to basically collate them together and mail them. And so that was our kind of our inauspicious beginnings. And we had $300 between us to publish the magazine, and that was our budget for the first 6 months. And we thought, we've got $300. That's enough to publish 6 issues for 6 months. And if the money comes in, we'll keep publishing. If it doesn't, well, we mark it down as we tried, but the political support or the interest just wasn't there, and we'll go on to other things. That was 32 years ago. So we've steadily seen just a lot of support and interest around the issue of prisoner rights, and HRDC grew. For our first 6 years, we were an all-volunteer organization. And over the course of that time period, our demographics, I guess, for lack of a better term, changed. And we saw ourselves kind of evolving from more than just a Washington newsletter. By around 1992, 93, we still had a majority of our subscribers were in Washington State. Starting around 94, 95, which is when the mass incarceration binge really started taking off in the United States, we really saw our numbers start to change. And to put this into context, in 1990, when Prison Legal News first published, the United States had 1 million prisoners locked up in state, federal prisons, and local jails. And by 2000, within 10 years, that number doubled to 2 million. So in some respects, you can say, it took the United States, 224 years or 214 years to lock up its first 1 million people. And then it took us 10 more years to lock up our second 1 million. And today it's around 2.3, 2.4 million, depending on how you're counting prisoners. But even as the prison population was doubling in the 1990s, the number of publications serving that population was dwindling. And by the end of the decade, by 2000, we started the decade with around 50 to 60 independent prisoner rights publications. By 2000, there was around 4 of us left. And as time went on, we're pretty much it. There really aren't any other, prisoner rights publications that are publishing these days. So along the way, like I say, we changed, the organization grew. We added paid staff, and then we've slowly been growing. I published my first anthology on mass incarceration, The Selling of America. That's selling with a C, an inside look at the U.S. prison industry. I published that in 1997, and HRDC started distributing books. That was our first book that we started distributing. My next anthology was in 2003, and that book was Prison Nation, The Warehousing of America's Poor. And then 2008, our third anthology was Prison Profiteers, Who Makes Money Off Mass Incarceration. So, these have been, and that kind of further got us along the book distribution route. Starting in 2009, we started publishing books. And since then, we've published around almost a half dozen titles. We published the Habeas Cite book, a book on ineffective assistance of counsel. We published another one, an effective cite book on prosecutorial misconduct. We've published guides on how to get an education behind bars for distance education. We just published a book on litigation under the Prison Litigation Reform Act. So, we've been doing, basically, I'd say initially our forte has been around media and communications. And I would say that when people have asked, what type of an organization is HRDC, I'd say primarily we're a media organization but we believe in using media and advocacy journalism to bring about social change. And media and journalism is just, kind of one tool in our holistic toolbox to effectuate that change. In 2009, we started a litigation project. And since the mid 90s, HRDC had been doing censorship and public records litigation. The public records litigation would be, we file a lot of public records requests to get information to publish in the magazines. And so starting in the late 90s, we started to get more denials of our public records requests, and we started litigating around those public records requests. And also, censorship had always been with us from day one. Our first 3 issues were censored. We were in the process of filing a lawsuit to challenge that censorship of our first issues when the DOC relented, the Washington Department of Corrections relented. They allowed our magazines in. And the warden of the prison I was at the time told me that they didn't see any need to censor prison legal news because our ideas were too outmoded and too radical for the prisoners of the day, and that we would soon basically fade away and collapse. So anyways, on our 10th anniversary, I sent him a letter with a copy of his memo to me to that effect. I'm talking about, Jim, you were wrong. So we steadily grew. We also grew into a national publication as well, sometime around the mid 90s, first California, then Illinois, then other states started overtaking Washington as states where we had more subscribers in. We also grew steadily in size. When we started out, we had 10 pages. Now we're up to 72 pages. We've also added more. We also had another magazine in 2017. We began publishing Criminal Legal News, which is a 56-page magazine that reports on criminal law and policing and developments in that area. So we've steadily been growing, across these areas. We also do we do a lot of censorship and First Amendment litigation, challenging the censorship of our publications. At this point, I think we've got, around 12 or 15 state prison systems under some type of court order, injunction, requiring or mandating the delivery of our publications. We have dozens of jails around the country that have also been required. Where we've also successfully challenged bans on our publications in particular, and other publications in general. And recently in Colorado, we sued the Adams County Jail. They were banning all books and magazines. We successfully challenged them. And so, overall, we've had we've done a lot of litigation around the First Amendment and access to information and that. Some of the other stuff that we've done a lot of work around, we've also done a lot of work around the exploitation of prisoners and their families with regards to communications, specifically the phone industry. Starting in the early 1990s, telephone companies started basically paying kickbacks to prisons and jails in exchange for monopoly contracts. And these costs were passed along to prisoners and their families. And, we've been fighting against it ever since, literally 30 years now. And in 2012, we launched our Prison Phone Justice campaign, which was an effort to get the FCC, the Federal Communications Commission, to cap or regulate the cost of prison phone calls. And that was actually fairly successful. And it's kind of started a downward trend. The good news is it started a downward trend in the amount of money that prisoners and their families are charged or have to pay for phone calls. That's the good news. The bad news, or the downside, is that I think the success of our Prison Phone Justice campaign pushed these companies towards diversifying their revenues and finding new ways to exploit prisoners and their families. And so what they've basically done is I think their whole reason for existence these days is to monetize every form of human communication that prisoners can have with the outside world and their families in particular. And so they charge extortionate rates for everything from emails, text messaging, video calling, and of course, phone calls and money transfers. I mean, these are all issues that, they're really focused on monetizing and exploiting prisoners and their families around. So we've been doing a project called Stop Prison Profiteering, which is basically, as the name implies, trying to get these companies, and the companies are Securus and Global Tel Link, to basically stop exploiting prisoners and their families. So, and that's had some degree of success. We're currently suing companies that use debit cards. They take money from prisoners being released from prison and from arrestees that have been booked into jails, and they take their cash and give them fee-laden debit cards where they charge them very large sums of money to access their own money. So that's one of our projects. We also have an antitrust suit pending against Global Tel Link and Securus for charging people $14.99 for a single phone call from their loved one, primarily in jails. So this is some of the litigation that we do in addition to our core First Amendment and public records litigation. We've also done lawsuits with regards to children being held in solitary confinement and deprived of an education. We sued our local jail here in Palm Beach County, which was doing just that, and we obtained and we obtained an injunction and ended the practice. We also do a small amount of wrongful death cases, and the wrongful death cases that we take on or tackle are basically what we're looking for are cases that kind of illustrate kind of what's wrong with our criminal justice system. And in other words, if it was just someone being injured or something bad happening to someone in prison or jail, it's not a case that we'll necessarily take. It has to be something kind of over the top. And that's just because we have limited resources. And when we're doing our cases, we also have a media component and a media strategy where, we want to be able to, use it as illustrating the need for change in the criminal justice system. So some of the cases that we've done, we represented the estates of 2 Hawaiian prisoners that were sent to private for-profit prisons in the desert in Arizona. And both of them were murdered by rival gang members. One of our clients, his name was Bronson Nanuha. He was stabbed 168 times by rival gang members. And he was in a maximum security prison unit filled with 50 or 60 alleged gang members. And kind of one of the things that I think kind of illustrates the problems with the private prison industry is in that situation, there was only one person on duty. There was only one guard on duty, and she was a middle-aged woman who was basically responsible for maintaining order in a cell block with 50 to 60 maximum security gang members. And not surprisingly, she didn't do a very good job of it. Our other client was, he was developmentally disabled, and he was trying to join a gang, and they put him in a solitary confinement cell with another prisoner who was trying to leave a gang. And the other prisoner strangled our client in his sleep. And again, this comes down to, why are they having 2 prisoners that are in solitary confinement ostensibly for their own protection? Why are they putting them in the same cell so they can kill each other? One of our other clients, her name was Countess Clemens. She was a woman who was serving a misdemeanor sentence in a privately run jail in Chattanooga, Tennessee. And she was 5 months pregnant when she started having vaginal bleeding, and she reported to jail officials. And basically, because they did not want to spend $300 by calling an ambulance, which would have taken her to the hospital immediately, they placed her in an isolation cell and had her wait until the jail van became available 3 or 4 hours later, and then they took her to the hospital in that. And by the time she reached the hospital, unfortunately, the child was in the process of being born, and she was in premature labor, and the doctors weren't able to stop it, and the baby was born alive and then died a few hours later. And we successfully litigated that case as well. Another case we did was in Washington State, and our 26-year-old client, Ricardo Mejia, he was serving a sentence for murder, and he went to the prison infirmary with a rash, and the prison's response was to give him hydrocortisone cream. The rash did not get better. In fact, it worsened. He kept going back to the prison hospital, the prison infirmary, and they kept getting. Then at that point, they prescribed a hot water bath for him, and ultimately, as it worsened, he eventually got taken to the emergency room outside the prison, where he was diagnosed with necrotizing fasciitis, which is commonly known as flesh-eating bacteria, and it was immediately diagnosed. He was taken to another hospital with a trauma center where they started operating on him, and basically he died under the knife while being operated on by having the decayed flesh being removed. Let's see, one of the folks had the question about who died. It was the baby who died. Our client Countess, unfortunately, she survived, and she's alive and well. Unfortunately, the child did not. But again, like I say, these are the types of cases that we take to point out. I mean, what's wrong with the criminal justice system? The lack of medical care. This is a huge issue in prisons and jails around the country. Private prisons who have a greed and profit-based motive, and that leads them to cut corners, to short staff their facilities, literally nickel and diming people to death. To save $300 on an ambulance ride, Countess's baby died, and that's that's kind of, these are the cases that we like, because we can make the connection between what's wrong with a system that leads to these types of results or outcomes. So that's why. Those are some of the outcomes. Those are some of the cases that we do, that our litigation team does. We litigate nationally. We've litigated, I think we've litigated around 42 or 43 states now. So including Colorado. And so the other work that we do also centers around public speaking, like this presentation here, media appearances. We talk to the media a lot. And so, we're kind of getting around and having a lot to, kind of shed some light on what's happening in the criminal justice system. But the critical thing, though, is that, everything we do is from an advocacy viewpoint. And in other words, we're not here to, from day one, our goal in publishing Prison Legal News was not just to publish a publication that told people, the criminal justice system is messed up, or boy, it really sucks to be in prison, or anything like that, but rather to point out what's wrong with it, and then also advocate for progressive change. And unfortunately, I'd say that, my 32 plus year career now as a prisoner rights activist, in a lot of respects, has been kind of more like a big fighting retreat. I can't say that I've made any big wins or any big advances in the past 32 years, because no one has. I mean, going by the numbers, the prison population's more than doubled. By every measurable circumstance, conditions of confinement have worsened. Prisoners have fewer rights and remedies now than they have in, certainly in the last 30 years. That's kind of steadily diminished. Prisoners and their families are financially exploited and monetized in ways that no one even dreamed of in 1990. So overall, I think that, we've seen a lot of change. Most of it is not very good, though. And through it all, I mean, the Human Rights Defense Center, we've steadily grown to, confront these challenges though, and as best we can. And in some respects, because we do it nationally, I think the good news and the bad news is that, because we're a national organization, we kind of have more of an overview of what's happening around the country than, than I think than if we were just operating in one state, or whatever. One of the other projects that we have, I want to talk about real quick, and then I'll open it up for questions. One of our other projects is also our prison ecology project. And for that, we started kind of looking at the intersections between mass incarceration and environmental degradation and such. And this in the context, especially in states like Colorado and Pennsylvania and Ohio and Appalachia, a lot of prisons are literally built on toxic waste dumps. The federal Supermax prison there in Colorado and Florence is built on an abandoned uranium mine. For example, there's a lot of prisons that are literally built on abandoned coal mines. And the amazing thing is that for a lot of people in government, especially, they think that building prisons on these toxic waste sites is somehow brilliant repurposing of unused or unusable land. Unfortunately, the downside is that they're exposing the prisoners who are caged in them and the staff who work in them to a lot of toxic substances that have very negative health impacts. And I think there's kind of two ways to look at the toxic prison. On the one hand, there's the prison itself that is toxic, where it's built on a toxic waste dump, it's built on abandoned mines, it's built on EPA Superfund sites. And then the flip side of it is where the prison itself is the source of toxic leakages or materials. And we see this in a lot of prisons where, and this is especially true in California and a couple other states, where they build prisons with a planned capacity of say 2,000 or 3,000 prisoners. Then due to overcrowding, they double the population, and so instead of say 2,500 prisoners, now it's got 5,000 prisoners. But when they increased the prison population, they didn't increase the sewage treatment capacity. So they overwhelmed the sewage treatment plant, and then you've got literally raw sewage being discharged into neighboring waters of the neighboring community. You have industrial plants or processes in these prisons also discharging toxic chemicals into the community, and things like that. So, and the other thing is, I'd say in recent years, our prison ecology project is also moving to kind of draw the connections also between global warming and climate change, where in the 1990s, a huge number of the prisons that were built in remote rural areas as literally tools of economic development, where they wanted to use the prisons to basically as a jobs program for poor rural white communities. And 20 years later, maybe that wasn't such a great idea, especially a lot of these same areas are prone to forest fires and other problems associated with, I should say problems, but extreme weather events, I think, is the name du jour for these things. So that's a lot of what we're doing. So one of the questions that comes in from Alfred Outlage is, why do you think it is that the U.S. has the highest percentage per capita of its population in prison? At UC Denver, the professors say that incarceration rates are declining for both juveniles and adults. Your thoughts? As far as the incarceration rates declining, I think that literally depends on state by state. We saw a little bit of a decline due to COVID and a little bit of decarceration that happened in some states, but in other states, they didn't happen at all. A lot of the reductions in prison population has been in a couple of states like California and New York, for example, whereas other states like Indiana, the prison population has increased, continues increasing exponentially. Where we've seen the biggest massive increases in incarceration is in jails, especially rural jails, where jail populations have gone up by up to 1,000% over like the last 20 years. So it depends on where that number is. As far as why I think that the U.S. has the highest percentage of prisoners, I think, for folks that are wondering, the United States has 5% of the world's population. We have 25% of the world's prisoners. there's around 10 million people locked up in prisons or jails around the world out of what, 7 billion people or whatever, and a quarter of those are in the United States. And I'd say, this one makes us proud to be Americans. We're number one in incarceration. My personal theory is that I believe that prisons are a tool of social control, and the ruling class in this country has opted for a police state model to control its population. And generally, I think that where you see high levels of social and criminal violence tend to be countries that have high rates of inequality. There's poverty alone doesn't drive either crime or imprisonment, but inequality does. And I think that the fact that the United States increased its prison population by 500% over 30 years doesn't mean that Americans became 500% more criminally inclined than the rest of the world, or than Americans had been, for the previous 200 years of our history or whatever, but rather, the politics changed. In other words, crime rates have kind of remained the same. They've been kind of flat, but what happened was sentences got longer, and the longer people are staying, the longer people are staying in prison, the more the prison population is. So I think that's the nutshell version on that. One of the questions from Vanessa Bañuelos is, what do you think about inmates getting COVID? Is it getting better, worse? Are they getting the proper care needed? Medical care in prisons and jails was abysmal long before COVID happened or came along. And I think that one of the things that COVID has shown just how bad that medical care is. What's amazing is there's some prisons around the country, including California, other states, where literally 100% of the prisoners have been infected with COVID. And I don't want to sound like a conspiracy theorist, but part of me is like, how do you get a 100% infection rate? You'd think you'd almost have to really try, because we've seen other environments, cruise ships, aircraft carriers, other places where people are in small confined spaces, and even they didn't get 100% infection rates. Ironically, around the country, prisoners have a higher vaccination rate than the guards and the staff in prisons. In some states, only a third or less than the staff are vaccinated. And what's been kind of testing has proven what was kind of suspected at the beginning of the pandemic was it was the staff and the guards who were the primary vectors of the disease that were bringing COVID into the prisons and spreading it around. That we've also seen a lot of steps in California, other places where prisoners who were known to be infected with COVID were moved to other prisons. It wasn't for security reasons; they're just moving them around to just do their prison shuffling. So I think that those are, I think to the extent that death rates are going down among prisoners, I think that's only because vaccination rates have gone up, not because medical care got better. As far as are they getting the proper care needed? No, absolutely not. I mean, people are dying every day in American prisons and jails from really basic stuff like diabetes and hypertension. People are killing themselves because they're not getting basic mental health treatment or intervention. So, like I say, I think that COVID has just been, it's just been exposing, I think, the fault lines of the problems in prison and jail medical care that were already there. Stacy Elder asked, what do I feel the best alternatives are to imprisonment and for who? I think that basically it's kind of almost like a wrongful framing of the question, because I think that if we look at the past 30 years or so, sentencing has dramatically increased. Today, people are going to jail that 30 years ago they would have gotten probation or a suspended sentence for something. The people that are going to jail would have gotten that probation. And then the people that are going to prison, a lot of those are people that would have gone to jail before that. Or the bigger thing is, if you look at how sentences have been lengthened dramatically across the country, at any given time, there's well over 100,000 people in this country that have been sentenced to life without parole or the equivalent. I mean, we call them Buck Rogers sentences because the sentences are far longer than they will live. And so I think when we see all this, these are the things that are kind of driving incarceration. So I'd say rather than alternatives to imprisonment. I think the big thing is sentencing reform and lessening sentences. And the other thing too that also goes unremarked is the criminalization of almost everything in this country. One of the things I think that, when you talk about police states in modern history, we talk about Nazi Germany, or some people would claim that Stalin's Russia were police states and things like that. They'd never, neither Hitler's Germany or Stalin's Russia, ever incarcerated either in raw numbers or percentage of their population the number of citizens that the United States does. But it's also one of the things too is that for the most part, even police states wait for people to commit a crime. And one of the brilliant things about the American police state is we lock people up that aren't even charged with criminal offenses. And one of the things when we're suing jail, we sue a lot of jails. And I remember looking at one jail in South Carolina, is the Columbia County Jail. They had around 500 prisoners. I'm looking at the roster to see what people are incarcerated for. And half the prisoners in the jail are incarcerated for being too poor to pay child support. And this isn't even a criminal offense. And so we did an article after that. I was just curious how many people are locked up on a given day for being too poor to pay child support. And as of a couple of years ago, and I'm pretty sure we're the first organization to look at it, over 50,000 Americans are locked up on any given day for being too poor to pay child support. And this isn't even a criminal offense. And I think that's one of the things when people think that, having children, most people don't think that having children is necessarily going to get them locked up in prison or jail. And on any given day, the fact that 50,000 people are locked up for doing just that, being too poor to pay court-ordered child support, I think is kind of emblematic of the American police state. The other thing is when we talk about how the legislatures, for example, create crimes out of whole cloth. And I think there's a fancy term for it, which I'm drawing a blank on, but it basically comes down to, some things are illegal because they're wrong. And those are the things that if you think about it, you go back to Hammurabi's Code or the Ten Commandments, as long as there's been laws, there's laws against murder, there's laws against robbery or theft, things like that. So these are all the things, or rape. As long as there have been laws, we know that these things are wrong and they're illegal. That's why there's a law against them. But then the modern American police state, though, criminalizes, vast amounts of behavior that a lot of people don't even think of as illegal. And that's one of the things that when you start looking at how many people are locked in cages for things. I mean, the war on drugs is the most obvious one. And despite the ubiquity of laws against heroin or cocaine or marijuana or whatever, just remember, up until like the 1920s, none of these substances were illegal. People could openly and freely buy cocaine or heroin and that. And so they were made illegal, they were criminalized. And I guess the question there is, is American society any better for this? When you look at the massive loss of civil liberties and freedoms that I think a lot of us can only think about these days or dream about, compared with the hundreds of thousands or millions of people that locked in cages over these laws. So we have that. Earlier in my presentation, I talked about how Washington was one of the first states to create sex offender registries. So now we have a situation where that's a classic example where crimes are created out of whole cloth by state legislatures and the federal government. So now sex offenders are locked up, they're charged, locked up, and imprisoned for failing to register as sex offenders for violating these registration laws. So, these are all things that are driving mass incarceration. Some of the stuff too is when you look at prison admissions, in a lot of states, 30, 40, 50, 60% of new admissions to prison are not because people have committed a new crime or because they've been sentenced for a new crime, but rather the parole violations or parole revocations where they violated the terms of the supervised release and they're being sent back to prison for what are called technical violations. In other words, they broke a rule that is not a crime. And that rule breaking can include everything from changing jobs without their parole officer's permission, getting married without permission, leaving the county, mundane things like that. So these are all kind of, I think, the drivers of that. And as far as when you ask about the best alternative to imprisonment, the best alternative to imprisonment in this country is wealth. And if you have wealth, chances are you're not going to prison regardless of what you do. So, we very much have a two-tier system of criminal justice in this country, one for the rich and one for the rest of us. And poor people get paramilitary policing, no-knock entry warrants, extrajudicial executions by the police on the street, and hard time, and rich people aren't getting anything like that. Are there any other questions?
Yes. So we have quite a few in the Q&A. So we'll jump over there. The first one says, as someone who is formerly incarcerated, what is the number one thing that you feel helped to reintegrate you into the community after you were released? And have you tried to incorporate any of that into your work with the Human Rights Defense Center?
I would say the main thing that helped me reintegrate into society was not being on parole and not having any type of supervised release. I think that was the main thing. I've long been an advocate for determinate sentencing. So basically people know how much time they're doing and have a set date on when they get out. And I would say the worst thing that can happen to anyone is being on parole or probation. And we see that in a lot of places. I mean, I'm not the only one that thinks that. I mean, we see a lot of prisoners around the country who, given a choice between maxing out their sentences in prison or jail or getting out on parole or supervised release, would rather max it out than go through the revolving door of parole. So I'd say that was the number one thing. And probably the number two thing is having strong family support. My family was very supportive of me while I was in prison, and they were supportive after I got out. And I think that that's kind of the reality, is that the prisoners that have the strongest amount of community and family support, I think tend to be the ones that do best upon release from prison. Because not having that family support, I think, is difficult. So as far as Adams County, the question is a question for later in the QA, so I don't forget. What was the reasoning behind Adams County trying to ban books and magazines? Basically, they banned all books and magazines at the jail, and they had various rationales about why they needed to ban books and magazines, including that prisoners could set fires with them and things like that. So, but I mean, these are all kind of basically post hoc rationalizations designed to kind of buttress our unconstitutional behavior. So we were able to successfully litigate through that, and again, we settled the case, so they have to deliver books and magazines. And unfortunately, this is kind of one of those things that we're seeing. We still see a lot of this around the country. So that's part of the problem. Ashley Sandvig asks, how long was your prison sentence and how much of it did you serve? I'm curious how parole worked back then versus how it is now. Now it seems to be that you can go before a parole board after serving half of your sentence. When I was convicted in Washington State, there was no parole or supervised release. So in 1987, I was sentenced to 304 months in prison, which is 25 years and 4 months. And I was allowed to reduce my sentence by 1/3. So basically, out of 25 years and 4 months, I served around 17 years of it, basically. And I got out of prison, and that was it. Basically, I haven't looked back since. So, and parole boards, like I say, the discretionary parole board, that tends to be, well, I say for a lot of reasons, I'm very much opposed to discretionary parole because it tends to penalize a lot of prisoners, at least at disparate outcomes. And it's also prone to manipulation and retaliation by prison officials. And let's see, do you know of programs that help felons get their records sealed and expunged? Also, do you have any tips with felons finding work once released? I actually have a loved one in prison. Any knowledge would be helpful. I don't really know a lot about the getting records sealed or expunged. I know it can be done usually for minor offenses. I don't know the specifics of it. I know there's different programs in different parts of the country that do that. As far as finding work, right now, I'd say work abounds. My advice to people getting out of prison is get a job, any job at all, because it's a lot easier to find work when you have a job, and you can always move up. And all I know is right now, like HRDC, we're looking to hire people. And when I talk to the folks that run the local reentry place here in Palm Beach County that help prisoners getting out of prison find employment in that, they're telling me that they get around 50 to 60 prisoners a week, and they tell me that everyone basically has a job before they even get out of prison. So, at this point, I don't know that there's, it just seems all you need to do is just be able to show up and say you're ready to work. So, how was prison when you were incarcerated? Were there any issues or things that you saw during your time that motivated you to start the Human Rights Defense Center? Well, the main thing was, like I say, kind of the brutalization and the dehumanization of prisoners. I was kind of surprised to see that. And ironically, though, I'd say that, prison in the 1980s was far better than it was. By the time I got out of prison in 2003, I was kind of thinking about, how things had changed. I was thinking, okay, I'm getting out of prison 17 years after I came in. Is there anything that's better? And the only thing I can think of is I think disabled prisoners had things a little bit better just because of the passage of the Americans with Disabilities Act. But in general, I'd say by any measurable standard, food quality, visitation, financial exploitation, overcrowding, levels of violence, everything else was worse. So I think that's kind of the overall assessment. Anonymous attendee, first, I love what you have done with your time while and since being in prison. Can you speak more about your crime and how it came to be? There's really not a lot to say about it. I was a military policeman at the time. I was in the Army. I didn't have a lot of money, and I thought that robbing a drug dealer would be an easy way to make fast cash. And in the course of robbing a drug dealer, he tried to shoot me, and I shot him. So that's pretty much the nutshell version of it. And that's unfortunately, it's all too common. I mean, it's as far from an original idea at the time, and going into prison, I was surprised. Well, I shouldn't say I was surprised, but I wound up meeting a lot of guys that were there for the same thing. So it was far from an original idea. Then, do you believe the war on drugs had an effect on the incarceration rates in the U.S.? Also, do you believe solitary confinement could fall under the Eighth Amendment as cruel and unusual? And the same person, Ashley Reichenberg, asked, can you talk about in-prison education centers? How useful do you think they are, and how can they be improved? Yeah, the war on drugs has definitely boosted the incarceration rates. I also think, too, it's important to note that I think that the war on drugs has had a bigger impact on incarceration rates far and above the number of people that are just convicted of drug-related offenses. In other words, it's not just the people that are serving time for, say, heroin possession or drug trafficking or whatever, but when you start factoring in the number of people that committed armed robberies to feed their drug habit and things like that, then the number is much bigger than the people actually just serving time for drug-related offenses. And I also think, too, that one of the things that people don't overlook is the rates of violent crime. If you look at the number of murder victims, for example, in this country, virtually a significant percentage, around 70 or 80% of murder victims in this country are criminals or convicted felons. And when you start looking at, what the high number of aggravated assaults and murders are among criminals, a lot of this is driven by the drug trade. And if drugs were not illegal, people would sue each other when drug deals go bad. But because they can't access a legal system of dispute resolution, they resolve things with guns and killing each other. So that's one of the things I think really drives the illegalization of drugs is also one of the things that drives both violence and incarceration rates in this country. As far as solitary confinement, I think it's a human rights violation. Unfortunately, I'm not a federal judge, and no judge in America has yet held that solitary confinement by itself is cruel and unusual punishment. And the United States has been locking people in solitary confinement for around 200 years now, knowing full well that it drives people insane, especially the mentally ill. It pushes them over the edge. And I think that's also one of the things you need to look beyond the American Constitution. This is, at the end of the day, it's a 17th century document or an 18th century document. I mean, we can and do a lot better. If you look at modern constitutions in countries like Canada or South Africa, I think, there's a better sense of, what human rights are today versus what it was then. As far as in-prison education centers, up until Bill Clinton and the Democrats controlling Congress destroyed prison education with the elimination of the Pell Grants in 1993, with virtually all state legislatures following suit. Prison education was actually halfway decent in this country, and prisoners could get vocational educations and even associate's degrees and bachelor degrees. When I went to prison in Washington in 1987, there were probably, one of the prisons I was at was probably at least 15 or 20 vocational educational programs. I got a certificate as a machinist and a certificate in information technologies. And these were solid real world programs. Guys could get certificates in things like welding, dry cleaning, auto body work. There were things that would actually prepare them for meaningful jobs outside of prison. And Washington didn't have it, was never big on it, but a lot of other states were, where they had higher education, where you could get a bachelor's degree or master's degrees. And as far as, as long as we've had statistics in this country, we know that the more education prisoners get, the lower their recidivism rates. By the time prisoners get a bachelor's degree, their recidivism rates are around 6%. By the time they get a master's degree, it's down to around 2%. And by the time they get a doctorate, it's down to 0%. And of course, this is all stuff that legislators have been busy dismantling. As far as how do you feel the rehabilitation of the prison systems is working? What do you see as an alternative to prison? There really isn't much rehabilitation going on in prisons or jails in America. It's very much about warehousing and just caging people. Very little, if anything, is being done to rehabilitate prisoners. I don't see there's too much going on there. And pretty much a lot of the rehabilitation programs that they had in this country were largely, gutted or eliminated in the 90s. That included drug treatment, mental health treatment, education being the biggest one, and of course things that maintain family ties and family communications. That's all been made worse. You say, from your perspective, what are your thoughts about restorative justice, particularly related to the police encounter that begins access to a criminal justice system? On the other side, what are your thoughts about restorative reentry? And do you see it as offering a more smooth reentry process for those who are incarcerated? As far as restorative justice, at the end of the day in this country, it's really almost like punishment plus. People are still being caged, they're still being sent to prison or jail, and you're not really seeing people not going to prison because of any type of restorative justice. The other thing about restorative justice is there's also kind of an inherently unequal thing where it depends on who the victim or alleged victim is. In case, are they open to it or whatever. And as far as police encounters, there is no restorative justice with a police encounter because no one's been convicted of a crime or adjudicated. Same thing as far as restorative reentry. When you consider the vast number of people that are serving sentences for basically crimes against the state or victimless crimes like, gun possession, drug trafficking, one of my cellmates once told me that, as far as being in prison, the parole board wanted him to attend a victim awareness class, and he was kind of mopey about that. And he's like, well, I go to the victim awareness class. I feel bad hearing about these people that have been raped or had family members killed, but he's like, I've only been convicted of drug possession and selling small amounts of drug to feed my drug habit. If anyone's been a victim of my criminal activity, it's been me. I've never hurt anyone. I've never done anything bad to anyone. I just used drugs, and I've spent 20 years of my life in prison because of my drug addiction. So I think that's kind of the framing too, though, is that you got to take into consideration the vast numbers of people are caged in this country for crimes against the state. Not paying child support, not registering as a sex offender, drug possession, gun possession by a convicted felon, things like that. That's what's caging hundreds of thousands, if not millions of people every year in this country. And who's the victim of that? So.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for all of that. That was the last Q&A question we had. Is there anything else you want to go over, or good to wrap it up? Or
yeah, well, one thing I'd like to say, if anyone's got any questions about what's happening in both prisons and jails, go to the prisonlegalnews.org. We have 32 years worth of articles, which last time I looked at, 65,000 articles or documents on there. So we have lots of information on criminal law and criminal procedure. Criminallegalnews.org has a vast amount of stuff on there that you can check out. And any questions or anything like that, just feel free to let me know. You've got my email, so feel free to reach out. One of the things I'd like to do is I'd like to give a huge shout out to Laura Rovner and the Prisoners' Rights Clinic there at Denver University Law School. They've really been on the cutting edge of doing some fantastic work for prisoners. And if you're looking for, work to do or study programs or whatever, definitely talk to Professor Rovner. She's brilliant, and she's really done a lot as far as doing cutting edge litigation and advocacy for prisoners' rights right there at your own university, right there in Colorado. So. And I think one of the other things too is I think that when people think about criminal justice reform or prison reform, I think a lot of people are overwhelmed. And you think about it like this is an industry that sucks down $100 billion a year. Over 1 million people are drawing a weekly paycheck based on caging their fellow citizens, their fellow Americans, and that around the country. But the thing is, every community's got a jail in it. Right now, from when you guys are sitting, I'm sure you're within 5 or 10 miles of your local jail. And how much do you know about what's happening in your local jail? I bet not much. And it could be that, you probably know more about what's happening in North Korea or the Ukraine than you do in your local jail, because there's more media attention being focused on what's happening in the Ukraine or North Korea than on your local jail. But simple questions: how many prisoners have died in the past year in your local jail? What are people paying to accept the phone call from a prisoner in the local jail, and who's getting that money? These are all simple questions that, like I say, you just by asking them, you can start the process of change. And things that get this screwed up in this country on its criminal justice system on its own. It's had a lot of help and a lot of work from above. But part of the reason it's been so successful is there really wasn't any pushback from anyone else. So I think people are kind of more aware of how bad things are and how bad things have gotten. And now, kind of after these policies and practices are entrenched, it's a lot harder to change them. But none of this stuff is written in stone. These are all a bunch of policy decisions made by a bunch of police state hacks and bureaucrats and the government. And they can be undone the same way they were made. So none of it's unchangeable. Everything can be changed. So. And there's plenty to do. Everyone has stuff they can do in their local community. You don't have to think, and you don't necessarily need to look to Washington, D.C. for being the the place of change or anything. Most of the stuff is happening in local communities. It's happening at the local jail. It's happening in your local prisons and places like that. And that's where you can actually have the biggest impact.
Awesome. Thank you so much. It's definitely great words of encouragement. I think for everybody here, for sure. I would definitely agree. Locally, I couldn't even answer any of the questions you just posed. I'd be researching that for sure. But thank you so much on behalf of CU for your time today. It was a great presentation, very, very educational. And any follow-up questions we have, I will definitely field them back to you, or Sheila will as well. So thank you so much for your time today. We really appreciate it.